Good afternoon or morning, wherever you are, and welcome to this webinar organised by Resilience First. I'm Robert Hall, the Executive Director of Resilience First. For those of you who were unable to view the opening video, Resilience First's mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. I'm delighted to introduce today this session on the important theme of the practical consequences for business of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the EU, signed on the 31st of December, and whether they be upsides or downsides, I'm sure you're keen to hear. With over 1,200 pages of the agreement, and with the details or more details to be worked out on a range of issues, the consequences of Brexit have still to sink in. It will no doubt be a topic for analysis for many, many months, if not years ahead. Hence, today's webinar is a golden opportunity to explore some of the major issues with experts who will address the early impacts on supply chains, the regulatory environment, and border security. I'm also delighted that Control Risks is partnering us today and kindly speaking. Control Risks is a member of Resilience First and has an excellent standing in the field of risk analysis and advice for businesses worldwide. To facilitate the session, I'm also pleased to welcome Bob Rothenberg, former senior partner at Blick, Rothenberg, and a member of Resilience First's advisory board. And he will be the chair for today's session. In a minute, I will invite Bob to offer some opening remarks and introduce our three speakers today. But just before, let me add that after the panel discussion, there will be a Q&A session, and I encourage all listeners to post questions throughout the session in the chat box to the right of your screen. I'm sure the chair will pick up as many of those questions as he can in the Q&A session. So please do ask as we go along. So Bob, the virtual floor is yours, and thank you.
Robert, thank you very much for a few kind words. This is a fascinating topic because I started my professional life just as we joined what was called the EEC at the time, and it's been through tumultuous changes, and to now get to a period where we actually have left. And having been through a transition period which didn't really make much change to our position to where we are now, is when the interesting times, I think, are going to start. We hear about various things. You know, today it's the musicians who are making their comments about why it's more difficult. And I'm sure much will come out in what we hear this afternoon in terms of what people have to say. And that's why I would endorse very much what Robert said, is like to hear your questions and your points as well, to see what we can discuss, given the analysis that we will get from our speakers today. When introducing the speakers, I do not intend to spend time reading their CVs. You've all had bios in the joining documents of each of us, and I'm sure that gives you enough to be able to learn a little about who we are and what we are. I think the one thing I would like to start by saying before handing over and asking our speakers to speak is that in a debate that I was involved in during the period before the vote, I remember having a discussion with Stephen Norris, who was very much a pro-leave campaigner, where he said it's very difficult to see actually what is going to happen, but even more difficult to know once whatever has happened and we've gone through whatever period it is, whether the decision to remain or leave will ever be known what was best. And that is very true. So I've been encouraging everyone with whom I've been working to ensure that we make the best of what we now have and look forward positively. Anyway, enough from me. Perhaps I can start by asking Alexandra Kellert from Control Risks to start our session off this afternoon. So, Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Hi, everyone. I'd like to start really by kind of continuing that theme that Bob was speaking on there, which is that Brexit is not an event. It's not one single incident or change. It's very much a process. And what I'm going to talk about today is particularly the impact of the recent changes on supply chains. But I would like to say that we really need to see this as a process that's ongoing rather than that the 1st of January represented a moment in time where everything changed. So I'm going to start by giving an overview of some of the things that have changed. I'm going to then look at what our outlook is for about the next 6 months, and then consider some of the things to look out for the longer term outlook. So, as we've said, the post-Brexit deal came into force on the 1st of January, and we didn't see what many had feared, which was this kind of, huge queues at the Channel Tunnel and massive shortages in supermarkets. The main reason we didn't see that is because a deal was done, and that meant that there was a framework to facilitate a continued movement of goods on both sides. However, we are already starting to see delays, and we've certainly seen sectors raising concerns about what that means for them. So the key difference is that whilst there is a deal, and that means that there aren't tariffs on almost all goods, there are major new bureaucratic issues that companies have to deal with. And this is causing some limited delays already. And the fear is that it's going to increase those delays as more and more goods are moving. A lot of companies decided to not go straight back to the borders on the 1st of January. And that's really meant that we haven't necessarily seen the full impact yet. So the key changes are a lot more paperwork. Checks, physical checks, veterinary checks, and that's all adding to costs that companies are having to pay. And we're seeing that some logistics companies are deciding just not to bother at all. And I think that's a major concern. So where do we see this going in the coming weeks? As I've said, possibly greater delays, but eventually companies will get used to what has come into force. I think exporters and importers of fresh produce are really most likely to see problems, because a delay to them is much worse than a delay to the goods that aren't going to go off and need to be thrown out. And some products are going to be barred completely. We're also seeing major concerns about things that won't be allowed to go into Northern Ireland in the coming months ahead. There's a grace period at the moment, but that is going to change. So really, over the coming months, we're likely to see delays of varying degrees. And the big questions there are, what does that mean for businesses? Are UK companies going to find that EU businesses just don't really want to do business with them anymore? That's a major concern. And then likewise, UK companies might decide that it's just not worth the hassle of going ahead with sending things to the EU. And that's really going to be a kind of process of calibration over the coming months and year. And added to all of that, of course, we've got the pandemic, which is really, for many companies, that has been their kind of main priority, tackling that over recent months. So having that on top of the additional paperwork and complexities is really going to see companies having to make decisions about whether it's worth their while. Are they going to change their business practices to fit in with the new realities of the post-Brexit world? I think when we saw the protests of the seafood sector in Westminster earlier this week, and Boris Johnson responded by saying that this was being caused by companies not filling in paperwork properly. And I think a lot of companies were angered by that because they were given, in some cases, only hours to get used to that new paperwork. So as I said, I think we will see things improving there. But we also saw Boris Johnson saying that he wanted to try and kind of tackle the problem on a practical level. And I think we will see the EU and the UK trying to find some ways in which they can potentially ease things. But what we certainly won't see is the EU relaxing requirements. They might find ways to kind of streamline the processes. And, as IT systems become embedded, this will all become better. But I think we have to realize that, this is the situation now. Kind of live with it or find a way to do something that doesn't involve living with it will be the real message for most companies. And certainly I think that's what we're looking at for the next 5 years or so, until potentially the deal is up for reopening some parts when that period comes to an end. So we're not going to see major changes now that this is in place. I've talked mainly about the kind of UK-EU border, but I think it's also worth considering that with the UK having been part of the EU's trading bloc for so long, its relations with most of the rest, well, huge parts of the rest of the world in recent years have also been structured because of that EU membership. And what we've mainly seen so far is a kind of rollover of those relationships with third countries. But there are possibilities that the UK could completely kind of renegotiate its trading links with other parts of the world. So certainly there's a lot that companies are going to need to have to keep up with and look out for. And as I said at the start, this is a process, not an event. And it certainly means that for companies, they will need to keep an eye on changes. And as I said, at the kind of strategic level, really think about what their priorities are and what is worthwhile in the longer term. So, Bob, if I can hand back to you, those are my key points, but I look forward to any questions later on.
Alexandra, thank you very much indeed. And it's interesting, as you say, to see how supply chain in and out of the UK will change over the coming months and years. If I can now turn to Emma Shipps from Russell-Cooke, who perhaps will talk a little bit about the regulatory position and how this is going to has changed and will continue to change over the time. So, Emma, if I may, over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Bob. Well, I'm going to be talking today about the regulatory impact of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And I've only got 7 minutes to do it in. So of necessity, this is going to be quite a high-level discussion of that agreement. I've got a couple of slides just hopefully to keep you interested. So I will start by saying it is 1,246 pages. Alexandra's already talked a bit about the trading goods and the sorts of regulatory impacts that you're finding at the borders, so I'm not going to deal too much in that, save to say that as I'm sure you're aware, we're now in a slightly different world as regards VAT, and you will need to follow these new VAT rules. HMRC is collecting VAT, whereas it didn't previously. So that is something that you'll need to take account of. Now, interestingly, even though our trade and services accounts for 80% of UK economic output, that seems to have garnered less newspaper column inches and less commentary. But I think you do need to, if you are a supplier of services to the EU, you really need to think about the implications Certain industries have quite substantial implications, such as energy and telecoms, and I'm sure if you're in those industries, you're well on top of that. One thing I wanted to mention is that the e-commerce directive is no longer applicable. So that was a very useful directive, and previously, well, it still is in force in the EU. It basically says that if you are supplying services, online services, in the EU, then provided you follow the rules in your country of establishment, then it's taken that you're following the rules throughout the EU. Now, of course, with the UK no longer being part of the EU, that doesn't apply. So if you are a business supplying services to other countries within the EU, you will need to comply with the laws in all of those countries. Now, at the moment, that's not a terribly onerous obligation in many circumstances, because the laws are quite consistent throughout the EU, but it might be in the future we'll be pulling away, and you will need to not only comply with those laws but keep an eye on the laws in the countries where you're offering online services in order to ensure that you're compliant with that. So that's one point I wanted to make. Now, I want to deal today mostly with data transfers, because that is something which is probably going to impact more businesses than many of these more specific rules. So effectively, from 11 p.m. on the 31st of December, we were no longer part of the EU GDPR. The UK has enacted GDPR into UK laws, so the laws are very similar. And luckily, at the moment, there is a 4-month bridge, which means that we can still transfer data to the EU without, and in fact, and the EU can still transfer data to the UK, and that could be extended for another 2 months. So at the moment, we are still in a transition period of 4 months to the end of April, which could be extended. The reason for that is that we are a third country in the eyes of the EU, and the EU is a third country in the eyes of the UK. So the bottom line is that we can't transfer data between the two areas unless some specific exemptions apply. Now that is something that I'll come on to look at in a moment. But firstly, if the EU data protection regulator decides that the UK legislation has achieved adequacy to protect its citizens' rights, then we can continue to transfer data. So if there is what's called an adequacy decision, then even at the end of this bridge period, we will be able to continue to transfer data, and the EU will be able to continue to transfer data to the UK as currently. And I was speaking to some officials of the EU a week or so ago, and they were generally optimistic that we would have an adequacy decision, but they did say we need to hope for the best and plan for the worst. They said it about 10 times. So I think the message from the EU is hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Hope that we will achieve adequacy, but plan that we may not. The other reason to plan that we may not is that adequacy can actually be withdrawn relatively easily, and there are some reasons which I don't have time to go into now, which are quite interesting as to why the EU may feel in the future that the UK's data protection regime is not sufficient to protect its citizens. But if we don't achieve adequacy, or if in the future that is withdrawn, what are the reasons that you can still transfer data from the EU to the UK? Well, there are a number of reasons, but the main one that businesses would want to use is the use of standard contractual clauses, or SCCs. And these are clauses that you would sign up to between the EU supplier of data and the UK recipient of the data to protect the integrity of that data. Now, the Information Commissioner's website is really good in this respect, and I would very much recommend that if you're interested in SCCs, if you think they're going to be applicable, your starting point would be that website. They've got a really good tool where you can build up the SCCs and input your own situation, and it will spit out some clauses. But 2 points I would make about this. The first is that they are standard. Don't start tinkering with them. If you change the clauses, they won't comply with the exemption. The second thing is that although you can't change them, you can augment them. And it might be that in the particular circumstances of the transfer that you're doing, that you might need to put additional items in to the SCCs. So that is the advice that's currently being given in terms of transferring data from the EU to the UK. In terms of transferring from the UK to the EU, or I should say the EEA, the European Economic Area, which is the EU plus Iceland, Norway and Liechtenstein, not surprisingly, the UK data protection regulator has given a decision of adequacy. So those transfers can continue as currently. A couple of other points to note is that if you do business in the EU, but you don't have a place of business there, then you would need to appoint an EU representative. And finally, and this is quite a general point, and probably everybody needs to take account of this, you do need to review your privacy policy or your information notices, because it's very likely they'll need to be changed. It could be as simple as changing a reference to the EU to be the UK and the EU, or it could be far more intricate, and you will need to talk about your standard contractual terms. So that's really a very quick overview of data transfers. The message being, we've got this 4-month period, really put yourself in a good position so that your data transfers can continue after the end of the bridge period. And if there are people sitting back and thinking, well, that doesn't apply to us, we don't have any transfer of data between the UK and the EU, just be aware, you know, have you outsourced your HR and payroll? Where is your pension provider based? Have you outsourced your IT? Where are the servers based? So that sort of thing can trip people up. So finally, I just wanted to cover a couple of areas, and obviously these could each be a whole seminar in itself. So very briefly, talk about business trips to the EU, because the free movement of people as well as goods has come to an end. And although taking a trip abroad might at the moment be a rather distant hope for most people, there may come a time when you would want some of your staff to go abroad for business reasons. The bottom line is that you would need a business visa or a work permit to do that, unless you can come within some of the exemptions that are set out in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which, to be fair, are very wide-ranging. So effectively, you can take a business trip, provided it's no more than 90 days out of 180, and it is for certain specific reasons, which could include visiting a trade fair, it would include meeting up with business associates, it would include attending a training session, but interestingly, it wouldn't include giving a training session. And it wouldn't include assisting with a live performance. So there are some things that could trip you up. And in addition, some countries have put additional restrictions on top, including Hungary, Cyprus, and Denmark. So you will really need to look at the provisions if you are sending your staff abroad. Hiring staff from the EU, well, as I say, that's the subject of a much longer discussion. But the one thing I would say is that if your staff are entitled to apply for settled status, then make sure they do that by the 30th of June, because that is a hard cutoff. And you might find empty desks on the 1st of July if they haven't applied for settled status. Just finally, I would say professional qualifications. So if your business relies on providing people with particular qualifications to EU businesses, those qualifications may no longer be recognised throughout the EU, and any sort of transfer requirements may be much more difficult to comply with. So again, that's a question of business by business. You would need to look at what the impact would be. So that's really, as I say, a very quick romp through the regulatory impact, and I'll pass you back to Bob now.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. A whole host of topics there, in which there no doubt is an enormous amount of detail that we will still need to look at. Thank you, and looking forward to coming back on the panel on a couple of questions there. Now, can I turn to John Vine John is kindly going to speak to us about the security implications. And rather than me say anything more, can I hand straight over to John? Thank you.
Thanks, Bob, and well, good afternoon, everybody. So, welcome to a world of opportunity for organised crime in the the post-Brexit world. One of the documents I always think is well worth a read is the National Crime Agency assessment of serious and organised crime. It's an open source document. It was recently published at the end of 2020. 64 pages long, I think, but you only need to get to page 13 before it starts talking about border vulnerabilities. And many of the concerns that the National Crime Agency have and law enforcement have that have existed for some time around the borders are going to continue, but are going to be amplified, and there are going to be new opportunities for organised crime in the post-Brexit world. So let's just think about what happens at the moment. Obviously, organised crime is very much involved in people smuggling, the smuggling of contraband goods, including drugs and firearms. And of course, when it comes to people smuggling, of course, increasingly they are looking at routes which are dangerous, both for people that are the subject of the smuggling, but also for others. So we had the awful tragedy, of course, in October 19, 39 people found dead in the back of a refrigerated lorry. And the efficiency of border agency in dealing with, for example, people crossing the channel in small boats, then the greater the opportunity, I think, for organised crime to look at more risky routes back to refrigerated lorries. And of course, delays and the new restrictions that are being brought in a post-Brexit world will facilitate people accessing that sort of transport more so than, in fact, or in an easier way than was the case before. The organised crime groups also are very much into corruption of handlers, drivers, in order to facilitate this trade, and that will continue. And the ability to bribe and corrupt public and private individuals is well known, well facilitated as well by agents and solicitors within the UK. That's very much reported on in the NCA report. And I've no doubt that that sort of arrangement will continue. So the new opportunities, what are the new opportunities? We now are going to have vehicles travelling between ports and customs search centres that are inland in the UK. There are opportunities there for goods to be intercepted, for vehicles to be stopped, and for vehicles to be stopped and people, for example, who are being smuggled, offloaded from the vehicle as well. There are new documents, new procedures, and those procedures represent an opportunity for fraudulent documentation and counterfeit documentation. Again, that's something that's quite common, but I don't think a lot of people realise how common it is. In the NCA reports last year, there was an example of a ring which involved the issuing of 900 fraudulent visas to people worth, I mean, the value of this trade was worth £13 million. And so new procedures, new documentation offers organised crime a new way of earning money. The juxtaposed controls remain main targets for organised crime group activity. Those are the exchange of controls between Belgium, France and the UK. But as the authorities become more efficient in targeting crime groups using those routes, they will look further afield, which means longer journeys, for example, in terms of smuggling people, and more dangerous journeys in terms of smuggling people. The new vulnerabilities mentioned, including lorries moving from ports of entry to inland customs examination places, queues of lorries at ports, means there's an opportunity for the lorries to be broken into and for contraband to be either accessed or otherwise. Interception of loads in transit has become a new trend. Quite recently, I remember reading in the paper about I think it was a lorry load of Apple products that was intercepted on the motorway whilst the lorry was actually moving at speed, and the goods were removed. The driver was threatened, and so interception of loads in transit is becoming a new crime trend. And new procedures mean delays whilst people get used to unfamiliar procedures and unfamiliar paperwork. And those opportunities are probably now being tested by organised crime. So I've no doubt that there will be organised crime groups who are testing out routes and testing out procedures as we speak to see where the vulnerabilities might be in the longer term. What's the answers? Well, the answers are probably involved in the use of technology and intelligence sharing. When I was inspecting borders and immigration, very often the border force officers relied on a gut feeling about the driver at a port, about a particular haulier who'd come to attention previously, and they used their intuition and experience and some intelligence in order to stop certain lorries and to examine them in more detail. What we need is much more consistent application of technology to help us do this sort of thing, and to have consistency of systems between ports. Lots of talk at the moment about free ports being established in the UK, but we need a consistency of approach in relation to security between those free ports. Because we have to recognise that, of course, people using ports will very often vary the port they use, depending on, for example, if they have feedback that there's a delay or a backlog at one particular port. And one of the perennial problems that Border Force have had is matching their resources to demand and knowing where to place their staff in order to make best use of their time and to be more productive in terms of an outcome. And we need some technology now to model the resources, to model demand at particular ports, to enable them to focus their efforts on where the need will be most effective, where they can deploy staff most effectively. Up until now, it's been resource deployment between ports has been very hit and miss historically. Resource deployment models have largely been historic, and they've been based on an historic assessment of where the problems might arise. We need to move away from that, and we need to use technology and modelling in order to try and give us a better chance to fight organised crime and the opportunities that they will try and exploit in a post-Brexit world. Thanks, Bob.
John, thank you very much indeed. And wow, we got a lot more to think about there. Perhaps I can try and draw this together a bit by just asking each of you to come back on screen, if you would, and maybe we can then just try and bounce around a couple of thoughts and questions. And each of you has come with a slightly different angle as to what we're looking at from obviously your own individual points of view. One thing that came out to me, and something that both Alexandra and Emma said, which is that the agreement may be in place, but that also can be subject to change. Whether it's in respect of just reopening the agreement in 5 years' time or whatever the process is, or indeed in terms of where individual elements are dealt with. So in the light of that, how do you see the challenges for business in trying to work in what is going to be an ever-changing and evolving world, if you like, but certainly in our relationships with the EU. Just be interested in hearing a little bit about how business will have to cope with that.
Yep.
Who would like to kick off?
Yes, yeah, and I'm very happy to kick off. I mean, it is a challenge for business. There's no doubt about that. There's more regulation, and as you say, it is changing to a greater extent, because particularly businesses that do business in the EU is going to have to keep up to date with laws in other countries now, probably to a greater extent. But there's no doubt that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was a good step in the right direction, and I think the very perhaps what businesses were facing in terms of a very substantial change, that's sort of been avoided, and there has been some very good agreements reached. But it is going to change as time goes on. Some of what's in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is more of an agreement to agree. So I think it is a sort of watch this space, and businesses will have to keep up to date with that. And I think the other thing I would say is that certainly from the UK regulators seem to, certainly in my experience, of being quite reasonable in dealing with people who are trying to get up to speed with this. Perhaps the EU taking a slightly different stance, that they are expecting that people are completely on top of the new regulation from day one. So that's sort of been my experience.
Alexandra, do you think that over time, once we sort of got used to how the various bits of paperwork, the red tape, which people keep on labeling it as, we get more practice with that things will get simpler, and that there will be greater agreement to simplify that? And John has mentioned in his talk on security about technology, how much of that is going to be able to be dealt with by technology going forward that actually makes things flow more smoothly?
Yes, so I think it's in many ways ironic that for some people Brexit was about getting rid of red tape, when actually we're now seeing that there may be a lot more. Excuse me. But yes, I think it's certainly one of those things that as companies get more and more used to it, then it will get more straightforward. But also we will see both the UK and EU authorities looking to find ways to make it streamlined. It's in neither side's interests for it to be overly onerous to kind of prevent free trade, as it were. So yes, I think I would be broadly hopeful that things will become easier in the practicality sense in the coming years.
And do you see shortages coming through on anything in particular? I mean, I know there's some short-term things that are being discussed now, and particularly perhaps with regard to the vaccine. But I mean, more widely, are we going to see shortages coming? Not coming through? Are we going to experience this for some time ahead?
I would expect to see some sporadic shortages over the coming months, as there are. I wouldn't expect to see widespread delays at borders consistently, but I think we will maybe see bottlenecks occasionally that will cause limited disruption. I think the key area to be concerned about is in Northern Ireland, which is obviously now under different rules to the rest of the UK, and there will be greater restrictions on what can move between the UK and Northern Ireland.
John, if I could just turn to you a moment. You've talked about the effectively greater risks that it imposes with potential for organised crime. I mean, maybe I'm too much of a skeptic, but I'm pleased you think like this. But surely that with more checks going on than previously existed, right, the likelihood is it's more to be picked up. Although I do realise with the exchange of security information, that is an issue which is going to have to be faced and worked out how that's dealt with. But in terms of the I think you put it by the intervention in freight transport with the lorries. Surely that was always there as a possibility.
Yes, it has always been there. It's just that I think there's more opportunity now because, you know, the pinch points, which was represented, for example, by a port like Dover. You know, if you ever go down to Dover, you see thousands and thousands of lorries trying to get, you know, off the ship and away from the cliff and down the M20. It was a pinch point, and those pinch points are now, you know, potentially going to be removed as lorries are required to go to inland customs examination centres. But I think there are opportunities. There's opportunities with the technology and the tracking of legitimate trade, because one of the ways that you deal with, you differentiate people who are doing legitimate trade at the border or as a passenger, is you differentiate the people who are traveling legitimately, who provided you with the data in advance, and you differentiate those from the people who have paid by cash, who have got dodgy documentation, and you then focus the resources on those people who need the attention. It was always interesting when I examined, for example, Heathrow Airport, where you had a team looking at Heathrow Airport. It was quite interesting looking at there was an office there with lots of fraudulent and forged documentation. Most of it was EU documentation. It was the documentation that, of course, was given a very cursory look at by the immigration officer or the customs officer because those people were in the EU queue. The greater documentation was, of course, with people who'd had to apply for a visa and had gone through and had to prove that they had the means to remain in the UK, etc., etc. And so I think there's far more going to actually emerge from examination of EU documentation in a post-Brexit world than actually we imagined would be the case. And I think the use of technology and to try and to differentiate, you know, one sort of trader from another, and to build up a sort of a picture of who are the people to trust and who are the people to focus on, is perhaps a way in which we can make better use of our staff at the border and be more productive in tackling organised crime.
Can I sort of widen the discussion a little bit by, first of all, saying, you know, it was like Y2K for those of us who remember it, that everything carried on the 1st of January without any real difficulties. COVID may have made things actually simpler for that because far less people are actually traveling and moving around and there's less activity. But if one tries to look ahead and say, once we get through whatever wrinkles here are in the short term, right? What are the benefits that are going to come from this? I mean, we've been told by politicians, depending on which side they come from, it's either good or bad, and of course there are two sides to it. Here we're talking about the difficult issues, but are we actually, you know, looking at areas where business can take advantage of the position that we're in now? And Emma, perhaps I can just start off
Sure.
with you,
Yeah.
as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, because obviously we do focus perhaps on the increase in regulation and the increased checks at the border. And really it is worth sort of lifting our eyes off the printed page of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to see what the opportunities are, because always with great change comes opportunity. That just is what happens throughout history. So I think that for those businesses that are entrepreneurial, that are agile, you could probably spot gaps in the market, areas where more traditional businesses are no longer able to do things as profitably as they once did. And there will be opportunities for those types of business. I mean, even to the extent of anybody advising businesses about trying to get their items across the border are likely to be seeing an influx of work at the moment. So there will be people who actually, this is this is producing more work for. And sort of for the longer term, I think those businesses who are, as I say, willing to sort of do things a bit differently will probably find that this opens up a bit of the landscape for them.
Thank you. John, just turning perhaps to some of the law enforcement agreements. I'm not clear what might have been the position with non-EU countries and how that would fit in. And one of the questions that has been asked is there not exchange of information anyway with various countries as to what happens?
Yeah, there is exchange. I mean, obviously, one of the biggest concerns has been access to European databases by UK law enforcement. And I'm not, I think in the agreement, I think there's some sort of arrangements whereby that can continue. I think it's the Schengen Information System, which I think was of a great worry to UK law enforcement, because I think they were going to have to fall back on old sort of Interpol agreements around checking of people. So, but usually police forces really work quite well together practically to try and get the job done. And of course, some arrangements like the juxtaposed controls are bilateral agreements anyway that have been in place for many, many years. And when I inspected them some years ago, I found excellent cooperation between the French, the Belgian and the British authorities. It's just that, you know, cops just try and get the job done on the ground, irrespective of what the bureaucracy is. So I think that'll work through. I think one of the challenges the Europeans have had is with the Schengen area. In recent years, many European countries have moved to invoke the exemption that they've had in the European law to impose checks on borders within the Schengen area, because they've not known who's been moving across borders. And that's something which it'll be interesting to see how the British authorities liaise with their European counterparts in a post-Brexit world around the practicalities of knowing who is where and which borders they're crossing.
One question, John, that's been asked is, will the UK become a base for EU crime?
Well, I hope not.
I'm trying to think of the opportunities that might be created by us being outside the EU to facilitate that. And I suppose, again, it's only about information, isn't it?
Well, it is. And it's really important that we know what's happening very quickly. I mean, as I said, I think organised crime will be out there now testing the systems, looking at the bureaucracy, looking at the new paperwork, looking to see where the weaknesses, you know, could be exploited. So, you know, National Crime Agency and its partners and needs to be on top of that. We need to identify, you know, what those trends are very quickly and ensure that we put in place measures to prevent that being exploited. But I mean, it's a bit like, you know, if you squeeze one end of a half-inflated balloon, you know, it bulges out at the other end. And very often it's like that in security. You know, so you put, say, the efforts in trying to stop, you know, people putting their lives at risk in small boats across the channel, but then, you know, other methods will be found or exploited, you know, to try and avoid law enforcement in different ways.
Yeah, and of course, I don't know what it means for information being provided. It's a question someone's asked, provided by us to the EU. Because presumably they're also losing information, which would, you know, clearly make it more difficult for EU enforcement authorities.
Yeah, well, they will need all the cooperation with their British counterparts that they've always had.
Yeah. Well, I won't go into the logic of why it hasn't been part of the agreement. Let's hope that is something that's supplemented as time moves on. Perhaps I can just turn to small business and small businesses and how they are likely to find some of the changes in the processes, particularly the logistics of moving goods, also in provision of services where they're used to getting on a plane and giving advice to a client in a European city, country, which may be handicapped. Are there more, actually, can one look at it and say there are potentially more opportunities for them or not?
Shall I take that?
Yes, by all means.
I think it can go both ways, and I think we may see that small businesses find the extra costs disproportionately affect their businesses, but it might also mean that they can benefit from where, for example, if they're a UK-based company, they might find that EU-based companies are interested in doing that business in the UK, so they could potentially expand their more local business in that way. And I think it will, yes, really come down to having to weigh up those decisions about, is it worth, for the volumes that they're talking about, is it worth having all these extra processes in place to deal with the EU, or should they just look at expanding their domestic markets?
Emma, is there anything you want to add to that? Or?
I mean, I think, Alexandra, that's exactly right, that, there will be challenges, but, if everybody is feeling the same challenge, then that will open up opportunities as well. And I think one thing that I would say is that in terms of finding out information about perhaps some of this new regulation, is that the government's website is really good. They must have been worked so hard after right up to the 31st of December to distill down a lot of this information and put it on their website in quite a readable way. So that together, obviously, I mentioned the Information Commissioner's website. So I would say for small businesses, a really good starting point is just to look on the government's website, some regulatory websites, and just find out what the new rules are. And then that could throw up some opportunities to steal a march on other businesses that aren't as agile.
Fine. And I think John is probably not necessarily quite in your arena to be able to contribute to that, but have you got any comment at all?
No, it's not really in my arena. No, I think look, I mean, I think at the end of the day, business, from a security point of view, they just need to be a little bit more security aware, perhaps. Going back to the point I made about, people being sort of corrupted. That's not, I'm not making that up. That's well documented. And, so they just need to be a little bit more aware about their internal security procedures, where they keep documentation, who's completing it, and any associations that their staff, might, be making, which the company wouldn't want them to make.
Yeah. Can I?
There might be some help that could be given to small businesses in making them much more aware of this sort of thing than perhaps has been the case in the past.
Well, again, one would hope that the assistance will be there, whether it's the government website, chambers of commerce, who I know involve themselves in trade quite considerably,
yeah,
and so on, and hopefully that they will be able to go there and know that they should be going there. That's part of the issue as well, where to find the information.
Yeah.
So as much signposting as possible is always a help. If you had to pick one challenge for the next 6 months for business, what is that greatest challenge going to be? Alexandra, do you want to start with that?
Put me on the spot. I think it's just getting to grips with all the changes and working out how that affects your business specifically. It's really, I think, just treat this as a kind of, it's not an interim period. These are already happening, but treat it to some extent for your business as if it is, and really try and get to grips with what it means, rather than just trying to fight the fires. Although that obviously will be necessary in some cases, but I think where you can take a step back and think about it, then treat it that way.
Thank you. Emma?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm probably going to go for the same sort of thing, which is the biggest challenge in the next 6 months is really to get to grips with how is this impacting your business. I mean, some of the stuff I was talking about around data transfers, you may find if we have an adequacy decision, then actually that's not going to be a huge challenge. So some of this stuff is hopefully not going to be quite as serious as it could be, but there will be other aspects for every business that does business in the EU, which are more of a challenge, and it's really getting to grips with the regulation because, as I said, you might have some sort of grace period in the UK, but whether you would do in the countries you're operating in the EU, I'm not so certain. So yeah, it's just that sort of information gathering.
And John, on the security side?
Well, you can't turn the clock back. You've got to live with what you have. So try and put as much learning into the next 6 months as you possibly can. Speak to other businesses and see if you can access expertise which helps your business keep safe.
And one of the questions is, the success of the various trade deals that have now been signed since we've left the EU. And I'm wondering, to what extent is that going to enable business to be more competitive than perhaps it had been when we were within the EU? And I have a completely open mind. I don't know what that's going to be and how that's going to turn out. And as I said right at the beginning, nobody knows what it would have been if we'd stayed in and now what it will be going forward. But do you see any sort of, if you like, green shoots out of the new trade deals, which perhaps are opening up areas that business hasn't looked at in the past, either because they haven't looked at exporting or doing business outside the UK at all, or had only looked at the EU up to now? Emma, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And as you say, none of us have got a crystal ball. In some respects, some of these agreements are simply putting us into the same position as if we were part of the EU trading bloc. But having said that, people want to do business with the UK. And so there will be opportunities that maybe when we had our hands tied with negotiating through the EU, those will be there. It's quite hard to tell right now whether the agreements Liz Truss is doing at the moment will produce that. Some of this is a bit light on detail, but that is the sort of hope that we would have. So I think that's something that is very much in the future, something that could happen.
Alexandra or John, do you want to add anything on that?
I don't know what more I can add, really. I mean, I do think that the only way to look at it is through the window of opportunity. I think from a security point of view, I think the more that we can quickly review any problems that businesses are having, the better, and maybe bring those to the attention of the Home Office and the authorities. So, something that an initiative to try and review security and to see whether there are issues emerging sooner rather than later, I think would be very welcome.
Alexandra?
Thanks, Bob. I think on trade deals at the moment, it's very much what we're seeing is rollover deals where it's just maintaining what already exists. But I think the next step is that the UK government really needs to decide what it wants to get out of new trade deals and then kind of go after those and potentially find new opportunities for British businesses.
Thank you. Well, I need probably to draw this to an end because it's almost 4. I really just wanted to say that I hope people are clearer or have some greater degree of clarity in any event. We have a lot to learn over the coming months as to how this is going to work out. The trouble that business will have will no doubt in terms of the short-term issues will no doubt dissipate, and let us hope that we can all continue to trade successfully. And indeed, as the pandemic hopefully recedes, business can continue to build. So I'll say thank you to my colleagues and hand back to Robert.
Bob, thank you. It just leaves me really to say, on behalf of Resilience First and Control Risks and all the participants who listened, I would like to thank both the chair and the three speakers for their superb contributions today. We will circulate a short summary in due course when I can get pen to paper. Finally, just do, if you can, join us for our next webinar on the 27th of January, when we'll be looking at the plight of the hospitality sector in the COVID world. And I'm sure you will appreciate the difficulties that space is having. So I will just say thank you, stay safe, and enjoy the US presidential inauguration ceremony in an hour's time.
Goodbye.
So thank you again. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.